Ladies and gentlemen, I hope those at the back can hear me, but if not, you must ask me to speak a bit louder. I'll just begin my talk by mentioning that the only, and this refers to, the talk is actually called Metaphysics and the Perennial Philosophy. Metaphysics coming first, that is, but that's not an important detail. But it explains why I begin by mentioning that René Guénon only once, as far as I know, entered into the academic world, which he did by in answering an invitation from the Sorbonne University in Paris to give a talk on metaphysics. And in that talk, which was entitled La Métaphysique Orientale, he began by saying that it would perhaps be better just to say metaphysics, la métaphysique, without any epithet, because pure metaphysics, being beyond all form and all contingencies, is neither Eastern nor Western. It is universal. He meant by beyond form, of course, beyond any particular religious form, and by contingency, the demands of perspective and the demands of human capacity. Metaphysics. He objected also to the English S on the end of metaphysics. He said, why do you not call it metaphysic? Why this plural? It's not really a plural, of course. It means that it comes after physics, metaphysics. Now, Guénon would have accepted as a partial synonym for metaphysical for the word supernatural, only on condition that supernatural is taken to mean beyond this world and, microcosmically speaking, beyond body and soul. Frithjof Schuon sometimes speaks of the metacosm in the meaning the next world rather than this world. And the metacosm, in this sense, is the lowest domain of metaphysics, the highest domain being at the divine level itself, and the summit being the absolute. Metaphysics comprises all this domain, from the absolute infinite perfection of the divine essence to the lowest of the paradises of the next world. To go back to that summit, which is sometimes called the divine essence, tradition is universal in this. In Hinduism, Brahma, the neuter form, the neuter word, and also Atma, which means self, they denote this absolute infinite perfection. And in Hinduism, both Brahma and Atma are expressed by the divine monosyllable Om, and they are referred to as Tat, which means that. This oldest living esotericism is identical in its metaphysical doctrine with Sufism, which is the youngest living esotericism. Here, the divine essence is also absolutely beyond duality. Beyond duality is what the Hindus mean by Advaita. Advaita Vedanta is the Hindu equivalent, therefore, of Sufism. And in Christianity, you all know, I think, that Meister Eckhart insisted that beyond God, in the ordinary sense, there is the Godhead. And he insisted on making this distinction, which created a certain scandal in the Vatican. And according to metaphysics, this one metaphysical doctrine, only absolute infinite perfection is real. All else is illusion. In Hinduism, the word Maya is used for illusion. In Islam, in Sufism that is, it is called the veil, hijab. And in both traditions, illusion begins already at the divine level, as soon as there is any question of duality, that is, of manifestation or creation. The monotheistic religions speak of creation, but on the inward side, esoterically, Sufism, like Hinduism, speaks of manifestation. Everything that exists is a manifestation of the absolute infinite perfection. Creation or manifestation is the first hint of relativity, that is, of illusion. And this begins at the level of the personal God. St. Augustine said, you will remember, because for the ancient Greeks, for Plato, this absolute was to agathon, the good. And St. Augustine said, it is in the nature of the good to communicate itself. And there is a saying in Islam where God speaks on the tongue of the Prophet, alayhi salatu wasalam, I was a hidden treasure and I loved to be known, and so I created the world. To manifest, understood, my hidden treasure. Here is the beginning of illusion. This is a mystery that the absolute infinite perfection remains immutable. It cannot change. It is not affected by its own manifestation, which is illusion, and which proceeds from him. Just as it proceeds from him, it returns to him. Schuon sums this up wonderfully in the words, being what it is, the absolute cannot not be immutable, and it cannot not radiate. Immutability or fidelity to itself, and radiation or gift of itself. There lies the essence of all that is. The great Algerian Sheikh Ahmed Al-Alawi, I noticed that my book on him is to be found somewhere. I saw it somewhere here this evening. In one of his poems, he speaks of illusion, the veil, that is everything which proceeds from God. He says, it is hidden in its own outward manifestation, wherein it doth appear as veil after veil made to cover its glory. That is, the truth, the reality is hidden in its own outward manifestation. And it appears in this outward manifestation as veil after veil made to cover its glory. Now, as I said, the lower boundary of metaphysics can be placed at the lowest of the paradises. And the barrier between the next world and this is represented in many different ways. And here again, in this, the different expressions of metaphysics, in the different traditions, the same symbols are used. For example, in Genesis we have the words, the Spirit of God breathed on the face of the waters, and the waters were divided. Now, Hinduism also speaks of the upper waters and the lower waters. The division of the waters is the distinction between this world, the lower waters, and the next world, which is the higher waters. And the boundary between the two is what I'm just going to speak about now for the moment. In Islam, you have also in the Quran mention of the two seas, one salt and bitter, that is the lower waters, this world, the other fresh and sweet, the next world, that is the world of the heavens and the paradises. And in ancient Greece, you have another very striking symbol, the Symplegades, the clashing rocks. It is, you remember when the Argonauts went in search of the golden fleece, the clashing rocks were held apart by the goddess Athene to allow them to pass. The golden fleece is clearly representative of all that man had lost at the fall. The Quran says if you would pass beyond the boundary of heaven and earth, by heaven here it doesn't mean the heaven of the next world, it means simply the sky. Do so, but you cannot pass without authority. And in my book, also another book of mine I noticed out there, I have entitled one of the chapters, this is a book called Symbol and Archetype, and the second chapter in the book is precisely about, it's called The Decisive Boundary, and it is about this particular boundary, which is very important, of crucial importance to us all, because it is that beyond which we have to go, and beyond which even lies the heart, what is called spiritually the heart often join often in the expression the eye of the heart. But that eye is still in the domain of metaphysics, because it is on the other side of the boundary from here. The golden fleece was in the domain of metaphysics. You have to pass, you cannot pass through. Another symbol, just again to mention, I forgot to say, was the passage of the children of Israel across the waters of the Red Sea. That again is an example comparable to the Greek. God held the waters of the Red Sea apart, just as the goddess Athene held the clashing rocks apart. And so the children of Israel were able to pass across. But their enemies, the sea came together and drowned them. The passage through this narrow gate, again I use the words used by Christ, enter ye in at the narrow gate. A difficult passage, mentioned, symbolized by in many different ways. The word transcendent, strictly speaking, coincides with metaphysics. That trans is in the word meta, and the word transcendent can only be used of what lies beyond the clashing rocks, beyond the narrow gate, and beyond the barrier, the barzakh in Arabic, which separates the two seas. As to the word sacred, which sometimes is synonymous with transcendent, but it's more general, this world was in the beginning sacred, but now the word sacred can only be implied, can only be applied to what here below is impregnated with spiritual significance. Because what is here below has become polluted, corrupted. What is impregnated with spiritual significance are the divine messengers, the founders of religion, those saints who prolong and protect their messages throughout the ages, throughout the centuries. And likewise sacred are the works of sacred art, which are crystallizations of sanctity in stone, and their counterparts in poetry and music. But first of all, we must include virgin nature itself, which was created to manifest the absolute infinite perfection. Now, metaphysics is included in Sophia Perennis, in the perennial philosophy, as that which concerns the intelligence. But man is not only intelligence. A religion, anything it can be called religion, religio perennis, must concern not only part of man, but the whole of man. And man is not only intelligence, nor is his intelligence altogether in the domain of metaphysics. When I was a student at Oxford, I was privileged to have C.S. Lewis as my tutor. And I remember a lecture he gave on the medieval perspective that prevailed in England at the time of in the 13th, 14th century. And he mentioned that it was dominated in many respects by what had been written by Boethius. And according to Boethius, the human intelligence has 4 levels. Firstly, I will give the Latin terms as used by him because they're easy to understand. Intellectus, then ratio, then imaginatio, then sensus. Intellect, reason, imagination, and sense, the senses. Now, of those 4 faculties, only one is in the domain of metaphysics, and that is the intellect. And I remember Lewis emphasizing that the intellect alone of the faculties is directly concerned with the transcendent, with the beyond, with the hereafter. The other faculties, reason is the handmaid, or should be the handmaid to the intellect. The intellect itself is only concerned with what lies beyond, what is transcendent, in other words, with metaphysical truth. But metaphysical doctrine, it means teaching. Teaching what? I'm not saying by what, I mean teaching who, what is the receiving, what is it that receives the teaching? The intellect? No. I'm not using the word intellect in the modern misuse of the word, because as you know, it's used to mean simply intelligence in modern language. But in the sense, the correct sense of the Latin intellectus, as used by Boethius, metaphysical doctrine is not addressed to the intellect, because the intellect does not need teaching, being itself metaphysical. It has direct perception of metaphysical realities, and in any case, in the vast majority of men today, the intellect is veiled so that it is not it cannot be reached by teaching in any case. That teaching will come later to what the teaching, metaphysical teaching, is addressed to, but it's not addressed to the intellect. The intellect is universally recognized as being enthroned in the heart. And what is meant by heart in the inner aspects of the different religions is not the center of the body, but it is the center of the soul, the heart as the center of the psychic substance. And you've all heard mention of the eye of the heart. And that eye is only that eye can perceive metaphysical truth directly. And that sight is what man lost at the fall. hearts became veiled. This is a universal doctrine. One finds it in all religions. The Quran says it is not the eyesights which are blind, it is the hearts in the breasts which are blind. In the Beatitudes, you remember the words, "Blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God." That sight is always associated with the heart. The Prophet of Islam said, "My heart is awake like the hearts of the prophets before me." The wake of the heart means that it can see. The eye is open. And the purpose, the main purpose in all esotericisms is to open that inward eye which is blind in the soul. Eckhart was referring to this when he said, in the soul there is something uncreated and uncreatable. That is the intellect. And this is the intellect in the true sense as used by Boethius, and it is the intellect which sees the metaphysical realities of the next world. And that is what the inner aspect of religion is about, is concerned with. Wherever you go, Hinduism, Buddhism, and the three monotheistic religions in their mysticisms are all concerned primarily with this. It is as if at the fall of man, human consciousness had been abstracted from the heart at the fall and then drawn out backwards and downwards through the narrow gate in the wrong direction, between the clashing rocks, again in the wrong direction, so as to be imprisoned altogether in this world. In other words, at the fall, man lost the direct sense of the transcendent. Hence the need for metaphysics, which is, as we have seen, the doctrine of the transcendent. Now, in some, to go back to teaching, the question of teaching, in some very exceptional cases, that doctrine can unveil the intellect, if it's not too heavily veiled, in a flash of light, as it were. And that is sometimes called intellection. But that is a grace which no one has the right to rely on as a possibility for himself or herself. The main function of metaphysics has to do with what we call intuition. The heart is, as we have seen, on the other side of the narrow gate and the clashing rocks. But the human mind is not immediately on this side of that gate. Above the mind there lies what we sometimes call the higher reaches of human intelligence. And these reaches are the domain of intuition. I'll come back in a moment to the effect of metaphysics in this domain, but first of all I must say a word about the perennial philosophy. There is in one of Fritjof Schwann's books it ends, the English version is called, I think, Light on the Ancient Worlds. It has been said more than once that total truth is inscribed in an immortal script in the very substance of our intelligence. What the different revelations do is to crystallize and actualize in different degrees a nucleus of certitudes which not only abides forever in the divine omniscience, but also sleeps by refraction in the kernel of the individual. In other words, according to the perennial philosophy, total truth is inscribed in the depths of every human being, where in most cases today it sleeps. It sleeps in the kernel of the individual. But it sleeps in different degrees. Now, there is a reference to religio perennis implicitly, not of course explicitly, in Sophocles' play Antigone, a very moving passage. The situation is as follows. The two sons of Oedipus have been fighting against each other in a civil war, and they are living in Thebes, and Creon, the king of Thebes, after the battle, both brothers are killed. After the battle, he gives an order that the brother who was loyal to Thebes shall be buried with all honors, but that his brother, the other one who was fighting against the city, his body must be left on the battlefield to rot, and nobody must bury it. Now, Antigone is their sister, and she goes to the king and says that he cannot make this decree, that he must allow her to bury the brother, even though he was fighting against the city. He must allow her to go out and bury her brother. And he refuses. And she says, I did not think that you'd be capable of acting against the unwritten and unfailing statutes of the gods. These are not of today nor yesterday, but from all time, and no one knoweth when they were first put forth. That is a very clear reference to religio perennis. That is something which is inscribed in, as Schuon says, in our intelligences. And it is something universal. It's not a question of how a body is to be buried, whether to be burnt or whether to be placed in the earth. It is a question of the fact that the living are under the obligation to look after their dead. They cannot abandon them. This is an aspect of which Antigone understood of these unwritten and unfailing statutes of the gods. And there lies the tragedy. She disobeys Creon, and well, you might look at the play for yourselves, because I can't. It is indeed a wonderful play. I will again quote what Fritjof Schuon says about the development of the cycle. In the Golden Age, men lived on the memory of the lost paradise and on their inward religion. That was religio perennis. They did not need an outwardly revealed religion. Then men became affected by passions to the point of forgetting certain aspects of truth, and religions like Hinduism were revealed. But when passions dominated men, still more religions were needed, like the last three of this cycle of time. But each one has an inner aspect, like the older religions, which is centered on metaphysical truth. Again, I will quote from Schuon. Knowledge saves only, and this is to do with metaphysics, it's very relevant to this talk. Knowledge saves only on condition that it enlists all that we are. Only when it is a way which tills and which transforms and which wounds our nature as the plough wounds the earth. Metaphysical knowledge is sacred. It is the right of sacred things to demand of man all that he is. Now, what is this all? I mentioned earlier in connection with metaphysics that man is not only intelligence. And this all is intelligence, will, and character. Or you could say, instead of character, you could say soul or psychic substance. And that is why the revealed religions, who have to deal with man, they are for man, they're always threefold. There is always a doctrine. There is always a method. And there is always a moral aspect. These three, doctrine relates to the intelligence, the method is imposed by the will. It is the will that has to impose the method, and morals concern the psychic substance. They are the virtues. Every religion is truth, way, and virtue. Now, to go back to the question of metaphysical teaching, I said that it is concerned, first of all, with the intuition, which lies in what we may call the higher reaches of the psychic substance, beyond the mind, but on this side still of the narrow gates and the clashing rocks, not yet in contact with the heart directly, but nonetheless the intuitions are glimmerings of light which come from the veiled heart and therefore from the intellect. Metaphysical teaching creates in this domain, the domain of the intuitions, vibrations, metaphysical truths. When one hears, when the seeker hears metaphysical truths, vibrations will be made in the higher reaches of his intelligence, and these vibrations should normally awaken corresponding vibrations in the deeper reaches of the will. Because relatively speaking, we can speak of height and depth. The intuitions, the domain of the intuitions is objective in a certain sense. The domain of the will is more subjective. And these vibrations in the deeper reaches of the will are rather subjective vibrations corresponding to the objective vibrations of the intuition. And the will, thanks to these vibrations, chooses the absolute rather than the relative. It chooses the infinite rather than the finite. It chooses the eternal rather than the ephemeral. And the will says to the soul, I have decided that we shall follow a spiritual path. But here comes the main problem of spirituality. The will cannot say to the soul, and you will like it. In other words, you can lead a horse to the water, but you cannot make it drink. And that is the great problem, because if the horse does not drink, then everything is lost. Or rather, there will be a setback. I mean, there will be no progress can be made. And that is why in some traditions here is the origin of the what in Islam is called the Greater Holy War, when the Prophet was coming back from a battle in which he was victorious. His last, really one of his last military campaign. He said on the way back, we are returning, or we have returned from the lesser holy war to the greater holy war. And they said to him, what is the greater holy war? And he said, the war against the soul. The problem here is that the soul is made up of multiple elements. In fallen man, these elements are in chaos, and many of them are dormant. And they all have to be put in their right place. They all have to be won over. And that is why something like war may be said to take place. The means of war are, as you know, different kinds of asceticism, for example. All that has to do with compelling the soul to submit and to like eventually, because the soul has to come to love spirituality. It's only then that unity can be established in the soul of the seeker, and then there is no longer any difficulty or any problem. Now, in his book Echoes of Perennial Wisdom, Schuon says something very pertinent to this. It is all very well for the intelligence to affirm metaphysical and eschatological truths. Eschatological, that is what has to do with our final ends. The imagination and the subconscious continue to believe firmly in the world, not in God, not in the hereafter. And in another passage elsewhere, he says, the way calls for a re-education and a regeneration of imagination and feeling, which are falsified by the world. It is in fact the world that determines them, whereas they should live on the concrete consciousness of our final ends. This is the great difficulty which everybody is faced in spirituality, and it explains a lot of what you have read um, of mystical treatises in the different traditions. Now, another quotation of truths. This is again from Chuang, who I may say, as Brian Peeble mentioned, died only 2 weeks ago, but he has left behind him, I'm glad to say, a marvelous treasure of books and also unpublished, as yet unpublished documents. And this particular truth, I've never seen it uttered anywhere but in his writings. I've often quoted it myself. The usual religious arguments, through not probing sufficiently to the depth of things, and moreover not having previously had any need to do so, are psychologically somewhat outworn and fail to satisfy certain requirements of causality. If human societies degenerate on the one hand with the passage of time, they accumulate on the other hand experiences in virtue of old age, however intermingled with errors these may be. This paradox is something that any pastoral teaching intended to be effective should take account of, not by drawing new directives from the general error, but by using arguments of a higher order, intellectual rather than sentimental. An example of these errors of what pastoral teaching should not do, for example, which is continually being done, the arguments previously used, of course, like there is only one religion. Each religion claimed to be the only one, the only effective religion. That is now outworn, simply because man has accumulated by old age a certain wisdom. The collectivity has accumulated a certain wisdom, and it will not accept things like that, which were accepted in the Middle Ages. They were true in a sense, because if a person is practicing one religion, practicing it well, faithfully, in a concentrated manner, it is for him the only religion. There is a saying by a Sufi sheikh that in that particular sense, that if a person wants to find water, he will dig in one place. He won't start digging in one place and then go somewhere else. He will never find water. But if he continues to dig in one place, he will in the end find water. And but today, such an argument, it works in a different manner. That it's a good argument. It hasn't lost its goodness, but it doesn't work as regards there being only one religion, because people are now in contact with many other religions, and they see that there must be more than one true religion. God cannot have deceived most of humanity. And then drawing directives from the general error. Significant the other day only, when the Pope announced that he saw no reason, nothing in the teachings of Teilhard de Chardin contrary to religion. Now, it's ironical, the Church latterly has always been a little behind the times, and now when more and more scientific books are being written and published, proving scientifically that the doctrine of evolution is false, and that all scientific evidence is more on the side of Genesis than on the side of Darwin, the Vatican has to come in order to be up to date, has to come in at this late hour and say a good word for Teilhard de Chardin. Well, that is drawing, it's an example of drawing directives from error, the existing error. And he goes on to say, Schuon goes on to say, speaking of basic human values, what is it that makes, where does a man's spiritual worth lie? Is it in his intelligence, his discernment, his metaphysical knowledge? Obviously not, if this knowledge is not combined with a realizing will and with an inclusive virtue, or virtues which are at least sufficient. Is it his realizing will which constitutes his worth, his power of concentration? No, if this is not combined with the necessary minimum of doctrinal knowledge and with virtue. And spiritual worth likewise does not consist in virtue if this is not accompanied by a doctrinal understanding that is at least sufficient, and by an equivalent realizing effort. Obviously, the most brilliant intellectual knowledge is fruitless in the absence of the corresponding realizing initiative and in the absence of the necessary virtue. In other words, knowledge is nothing if it is combined with spiritual laziness and with pretension, egoism, hypocrisy. Likewise, the most prestigious power of concentration is nothing if it is accompanied by doctrinal ignorance and moral insufficiency. Likewise, again, natural virtue is but little without the doctrinal truth and spiritual practice which operated with a view to God, and which thus restore to it the whole point of its being. And he says, as regards effort, as regards the spiritual effort, remove the rust from the heart, and the intellect will be released. That is, as I said, it is the central concern of all spirituality, especially at the beginning, the eye of the heart, which is veiled in some traditions. In Islam, in Sufism, for example, they speak of the rust over the heart. Remove the rust from the heart. That means that the eye will be able to see and the intellect will be released. And he goes on to say, this release is strictly impossible. We must insist upon it without the cooperation of a religion, an orthodoxy, a traditional esotericism, with all that this implies. Now, let me end my talk with just mentioning that the existence of such writings as this places a very great responsibility upon us. We are all, whatever our years, old, because of what I have just recently quoted. We are living at the end of the cycle. You might say, well, what is this? What is the difference between us and the Middle Ages? 500 years. What is 500 years in a cycle which consists of many thousands of years. But the answer is that in the Middle Ages, that old age of the cycle was overlaid by the youth of Christianity and the youth of Islam. Now, both Christianity and Islam are clearly in their old age, so that there is no youth to rejuvenate this old age, and that is why everybody today is old. Whether they're young in years or old in years, they all have a certain old age. And with everybody, the question arises, which aspect of old age are we to choose? The positive aspect or the negative aspect? The fact that the vast majority of people, without realizing it, have chosen the negative aspect, which is senility. We have the possibility of choosing the positive aspect of old age, which is wisdom. Each one of us, in practice, theoretically speaking, at any rate, has that possibility. So let us reflect on this and let us make our choice. Well, that is all I have to say.
I referred in my introduction to the fact that the perennial philosophy can be said to have thrown down the most radical challenge to the modern world, and I also said that this had pretty largely gone unheeded, this challenge. And as I expected, Dr. Ling's brilliant exposition of the metaphysic of the perennial philosophy, I think and hope that we've all seen how clearly how profoundly this challenge operates and addresses itself to the tripartite structure of the human microcosm in a way that modern philosophy and modern art and so on fail to do. And I'm sure you will join with me in thanking Dr. Lings for so profoundly drawing our attention to what I think we ought to call perhaps the essential truths. Now, we do have a short time in hand, and Dr. Lings has indicated that he would be prepared to answer one or two questions, if anybody... Oh, that was quick. Yes.
As I say, if I can answer the question, I will. If not, we'll have to pass to another. Yes?
I've been dying to ask this question. You explain in your book, it's called one of your books, you explain what you mean by the intellect and reason.
Yeah.
And ancient beliefs and modern superstitions. I was trying to remember this.
Yeah.
But while I was thinking English, I had no problem. But when I was reading Titus Burkhart's book, Introduction to Sufism, he used the Arabic word aql. And once I began to think in Arabic, I got confused because you say that the abode of the intellect is the heart. When he used the word aql, I associate it with the brain. So when you talk about the intellect being in the heart, which Arabic word would you use for it when it's in the heart, and which Arabic word would you use for reason? You are quite familiar with classical.
Well, this is a very good question. But because there are different ways of looking at things, you see, Sufism tends to take, or the one aspect, I mean, there's one way of looking at things, this applies, this is universal. The truth springs from God, and in Islam we have not only the name, the divine name, which is the truth of the essence, that is the absolute infinite perfection, al-haq, also the name an-nur, light, which is partly equivalent with the name truth. Intelligence can be, which begins with the intellect in the Boethian sense of the word intellectus, and for which the Arabs use the word aql, is a stream of light coming from God, coming from the truth, from God as truth and as light. And that stream does not end at the clashing rocks. It continues into the psychic substance. And in Arabic, the word aql is used for that whole stream, the whole stream of intelligence. They sometimes speak of the first intellect, al-aql al-awwal, to distinguish between the transcendent intellect and what we have called intuition and reason. But the idea that the true intellect, in the Boethian sense, in the medieval sense, is nonetheless, there's no dispute, there's no disagreement about this. Islam, Sufism, is in perfect agreement with Christianity and Hinduism about this. It's simply a question of the use of words. And Titus Burckhardt, in his book, is speaking about the word aql, how it is used. In modern Arabic, in modern Egypt, for example, the word aql is almost exclusively used in the sense of reason.
What would you use for it? What Arabic word would you use for reason in the traditional sense?
For reason?
Yes.
Well, Arabic word, the word mantiq is logic, but also you have to use the word aql as well, but you have to make it clear from the context. It is all part, and this is not an error, it is not a doctrinal error, this, because the reason is a certain degree of light, and it depends on that stream coming from the divine light, the divine truth. Every aspect of the intelligence at every degree comes from that origin. But that's what creates the problem. Is that an answer to your question?
Yes.
Yeah. Is there another question? This gentleman here?
Yeah, I was just wondering to what extent you felt that, given that these four categories, intellect, reason, sense, what was the other one?
Intellect, imagination, and sense. Yeah.
To what extent do you feel that it is likely that the assimilation of sensory stimuli, for example, can contribute to shaping the intellect in terms of its preparation for receiving information of the divine?
Well, these lower faculties.
Yes.
Well, that again is a good question. The descriptions of paradise in the Quran, very beautiful descriptions, very moving descriptions, are addressed precisely to the imagination. And Fritjof Schuon, in the passage I read, said that the imagination should not be dominated by the world. It should live on anticipation of our final ends. When we see the beauties of nature, for example, the senses, again, our visual capacity should be able to see through. A spiritual man can see through a wonderful landscape. That's what, for example, the Taoists, their art of landscape painting was for, to enable the human sight to penetrate the things of this world and to see beyond, to see something of eternity, which you do see precisely in the Taoist painting. But just to look at a landscape, it is said also spiritually in most traditions that the pure of the soul, I go back to the Beatitude, blessed are the pure in heart, the purer the soul, the more transparent it is. And the more transparent objects become for it, material objects become, it sees, because everything, to go back to the beginning of my talk, is a manifestation of God. And it is there for us, going back in the opposite direction, to see him through his manifestations. That is what, is that an answer to your question? The senses are...
Yes, very much so.
The same with tasting. Sufism is sometimes defined as dhawq, which is taste, because direct tasting is a direct thing, not like learning a lesson, which is indirect. Thought is indirect, but tasting is a direct sensation, and therefore comparable, because the intellect works in that direct way. The intellect, which is lost, it sees directly metaphysical reality.
No, I was just going to say we've got perhaps time for one more question.
Yes, well, this lady here.
When you talk about the intellect, do you at the same time mean the soul? It seems to me, one you spoke much less. I couldn't follow very much about the soul. And I always thought it was the soul that really mattered. The intellect was merely part of the human body, the brain. The soul is something quite apart from the body. It goes on living after the dead. But the intellect, perhaps I'm wrong, is your interpretation. The intellect is the soul as well. That's all we said it was.
Well, the soul, the truth, which is again a universal truth, the intellect and the spirit are, in a sense, identical. The two words can be used for the same. They are both of the next world, both transcendent, both beyond. The soul is a prolongation of the spirit into this world, into the human body. And you see, when we say a person gave up the ghost, we're using the word ghost, which is used of the third person of the Trinity, the Holy Ghost. It's, of course, and the German word Geist means spirit. It is what is used. We use the French word, but we use the German word ghost in. But the soul, he gave up the ghost. It means he gave up this. He gave back to the spirit its prolongation, which was his soul. When they speak of the glorious body of the resurrection, it means that the bodies rise from the earth. They are glorious because they are about to be reabsorbed into the psychic substance, which itself is reabsorbed into the spirit, into the next world, because the souls cannot penetrate into the next world. Only spirits can enter paradise.
Then the soul is not the same as the spirit.
But it becomes the same. It is reabsorbed. It is a a prolongation into the body of the spirit. And it, of course, as a prolongation, it loses some of its identity, but it returns at death. I mean, this is the case of a saint. The soul of a saint returns at death to the spirit. Because in paradise there are only blessed spirits. There are not souls, but those are what were souls on earth. Some of them, at any rate. I don't know if that answers your question. No. No, perhaps.
Well, it only remains for me to thank Dr. Lings once again for a very illuminating talk, and to say I'm sure you'll join me in thinking, at least, that we hope it won't be too long before you come back and give us another talk, Dr. Lings. Thank you very much.
Well, I believe...